Hi, I'm Marc Bashoor, Executive Editor for Fire Rescue One and FireChief.com. One of the things I've heard a lot, you probably hear it a lot, I know I've said it before, as you're coming up through the ranks and you're becoming one of those officers, you hear that you become much less of a friend as you become much more of a boss. There's certainly truth in that. And in today's video, we're going to talk about discipline. But it's important before we start talking that we understand the difference between discipline as a noun and discipline as a verb. Now we're going to focus mostly on the verb in the case of setting up a discipline program. Suffice to say that discipline as a noun is the practice of doing things right. The practice of doing things right at the right time for the right reasons. As opposed to discipline as a verb, the practice of training someone to do the right things at the right time for the right reasons. So training or developing them, whether that's through punitive action or through a developmental process, that's the distinction between the two. Friendship is personal, work is business. And we need to make sure that when we're developing those disciplinary systems, that they're fair and consistent throughout. We know that departments all across this country are all over the place with respect to disciplinary systems, whether they're union or volunteer. And this video has no distinction between volunteer or union. There are certainly different ways to handle volunteer issues than there are paid issues. But at the end of the day, we're all public servants. And we're all public safety officials that's necessary to have to build and then have and maintain the public trust. And one of the ways we do that is by having a fair and consistent discipline process. Okay, so we're talking about the disciplinary process, and as I said, we're not going to make distinctions between paid and volunteer in this video, but it is important to have one aspect kind of explained, and that is that 27 of our 50 states are right-to-work states. So for the paid staff, what that means is they don't have to join the union. I think it makes them a little more vulnerable to processes that aren't codified in contracts or codified in law, if you will. But at the end of the day, those are situations that those people are faced with, and they make the decision whether to join part of that collective bargaining unit that has hopefully bargained a discipline system for them. It's also important to understand the Firefighter Bill of Rights covers a lot of what I'm talking about when it gets to a process for discipline. But again, that is something that does not cover EMS professionals in most places. Some places have incorporated it into their plans. And may or may not apply to volunteer systems depending on how the system classifies those people and deals with those people. So it's important that you figure out what your system, what your state and your system has and does, but it's also important that we work towards developing those systems. And I'll say that I favor a stepped system, meaning step one is a verbal counseling, step two is a written counseling, and step three is a formal process. You notice I didn't use the word warning. I mean, sometimes when we're talking, we need to be careful with the words, and what we should be doing is building a process that helps develop people and helps get them to the point where they either learn what needs to be done and they do those things that they need to do to improve, or frankly, they end up leaving. I mean, sometimes that's what the discipline process is for, is to get rid of those people who are not inclined to be part of the business. But that shouldn't be our focus of the system. Using those step ones, those verbal counselings as opportunities to counsel and train people. And step twos as that written counseling to be able to say, okay, we've tried the verbal, or maybe this is severe enough that we needed to go straight to the step two, to the written, and you're being put on notice here that you need to improve. And ultimately, step three would be the process. Step three being a process where there's a formal investigation that needs to be completed, that there is a panel of your peers or of the charging officer peers who hear the case and render either a decision or a recommendation to the fire chief or public safety director, whatever it is that your jurisdiction has. We need to make sure that we have that process, and that as we're building that process, it's also not a one and done thing, folks. Just because you get one step 3, one formal process, and you're found guilty in that process doesn't mean, or shouldn't necessarily mean, that you're automatically fired. I mean, there has to be a graduation of effort depending on the severity of the crime. So the other piece that I favor as you're putting together this disciplinary system is a matrix. Put together a matrix that spells out how many step 1s, step 2s, step 3s you can have before the next step happens. And the next step could be that formal process that identifies punitive actions, whether that's leave, if your system fines people, whether that's termination, whether that's demotion, whatever that is, whatever your system allows. Having that matrix that helps people identify that ahead of time, it helps put everybody on a level playing field. If I ask the question now, what happens to a firefighter in your jurisdiction if they're convicted of a DWI? They go to court and they're convicted of a DWI. What happens to a firefighter in your jurisdiction? I just about guarantee I'd get a dozen different responses from people all over the country. And that's one of the things that a disciplinary matrix can help you with. So the likelihood is that when you answer that question, it was much more about who they knew, who they were friends with, or who their father was in the fire service. So the disciplinary system and matrix helps you avoid those pitfalls, especially as a chief. And that's also why we have nepotism rules or laws that say that chiefs can't supervise their direct siblings or their spouses or brothers or sisters. Those are situations that have demonstrated the ability to get us in trouble as an industry, not just in fire, but in private industry and government as well. So that's why those laws exist. So once you've established that system, and then you have some kind of matrix that helps you put all that together and determine how many of this step and that step you can have, and what the discipline is going to be for those things, that puts you on that playing field that helps keep you level. Because like I said, I could ask that question about DWI or any number of things and get a dozen different answers very quickly. And that should not be the way it is. And we need to train our officers. We need to train the officers in the system. Whatever that system is, we need to give them the tools that they need to be successful in investigating and then bringing that system, bringing that person up through the system if that's what becomes necessary. The discipline system, I'll say this, and some people may disagree with me, but the discipline process should be the last resort. We should be doing everything we can to get people to where they need to be in our system, to be able to salvage those that might be marginal. You've heard me refer to slugs. To salvage those in our system that we might consider slugs, we should be doing everything we can to develop them and train them and get them to where they need to be, as opposed to automatically putting them into the disciplinary system. But if they get into the system and they get into the process and they're at that point, we need to be fair about it. And we need to make sure that we're giving our officers the tools they need to do the job they need to do. Recently I attended a short class on discipline that was being given to some officer candidates. And I walked in, I was there for a different class, but I walked in and there was a slide on the screen. I'll show you right here what it looked like. It was something like this. So I asked the students, I said, what's the most important thing up there? And without skipping a beat, 3 or 4 of them blurted out, union representation. I kind of shrugged my shoulders and I said, well, I guess if you're the party on, quote unquote, on trial, then yeah, I'd suppose you'd think that might be the most important thing for you. But what that shows me is a system of fear. That shows me a system where people are afraid that they don't trust the system, so they have to have the union representation. It's important to have the union representation, I get that, 100%. But I told them, as you become officers, and this is where that transition from friend to boss is very, very difficult for a lot of people. As you become officers, you need to be much more concerned about the investigation. You need to be much more concerned about the investigation is done thoroughly and fairly, and that all the facts are gathered and all the documentation is done so that you're able to present a case, or so that the case can be presented by whomever is that charging officer. Without a thorough investigation, you've got nothing. You can look at case law after case law in the legal system that points to the failure of management to complete a thorough investigation as the reason that people get out of the system or get off on charges that have been brought before them. So making sure that there's a thorough and fair investigation is going to be one of the most important parts of this entire process. So whether it's on the incident scene or while just hanging around the firehouse, out on the training ground, or right here in the classroom, as officers, we need to make sure that we have a process, that we follow the steps of the process, and that we use it fairly and consistently throughout our tenure. Whether we're talking paid or volunteer, we need to make sure that we have a strong labor management relationship. Yes, I said paid or volunteer. You need to have a strong labor management relationship. Everybody in the system needs to feel like they have a seat at the table. I can tell you I've failed at that from time to time, but you need to learn from that. Good leaders are always good learners. Thanks for joining us. Look for more information on the discipline process and discipline in general on this Fire Rescue 1 special coverage series. This is Marc Bashoor. Have a great day on purpose. Keep safe, stay smart, and take care.